But so let's kind of start walking through this framework, because I gave you my presuppositions: God-centered, not man-centered, although that doesn't mean that it's irrelevant or that it's not applicational, and being proactive rather than reactive, although that doesn't mean that we can't deal with particularly large issues when they might arise. But overall, at least in my opinion, a healthy church is going to have a healthy teaching ministry that is going to be God-centered and proactive rather than man-centered and reactive. The first part of that, the framework, the actual framework, is expository preaching. I think that expository preaching is a must. If we want to have healthy teaching, we ought not be talking about vampires and baseball. We must be talking about what God inspired the text to mean. And so I do believe that that can be done in topical sermons. However, I think, at least for me, the Sunday morning approach should be primarily preaching through entire books, because I do think if you just take a topical approach, there are certain passages that will elude ever getting preached, because the main topics that you hit on, we're just going to miss verses. And we talked about that in our systematic theology episode. All of the systematic theology textbooks that I read, if you go to the index, there are always verses missing, always. And so if I even go through and say, I'm going to systematically preach through all of these doctrines, all of these things, I'm still going to miss verses if I'm only doing topical preaching. So on the sheet that I gave to you guys, I included biblical theology, not systematic theology. And I believe that we have put the cart before the horse in many ways. I believe that we are living in an age where many people, not everybody, and I'm not putting people down. I just think it's a reality. We have such free access to the Bible, and many people think that they know much about it, but they don't. And there's so much of the Bible that they've never actually read. And if all they've ever listened to is systematic theology, and all they've ever studied is the big books that talk about the systems and talk about the major issues, there are so many other verses that they've missed, that they've not talked about. And they've only heard maybe the straw man of the other side. They don't even really fellowship with people of the other side. And so our context, I'm a part of a healthy church. It's not saying that we're perfect. It's not saying that we can't grow in our health, but I'm a part of a healthy local church. And one of the things that I think indicates our health is that we have both Calvinists and Arminians and people that would take themselves off of that spectrum together, fellowshipping together in one place. That's rare. It's not common. And one of the reasons for that is because I don't do systematic theology from the pulpit on Sundays. I stick to the text at hand. And if I'm in Ephesians chapter 1, instead of preaching the first 3 verses and then bouncing around to 13 other verses that, a Calvinist would pick 13 different verses that an Arminian would pick, I actually just preach the whole chapter of Ephesians 1. And I'll just say, well, I think the most relevant verses to this are not 16 verses from other passages, but the next 16 verses in the chapter. I'd rather kind of just go through that and see what Paul's train of thought is. Because as you said, Eric, if I want to follow Paul's train of thought, I actually ought to, follow his train of thought and just see what actually he says. That's revolutionary for some people for some reason. And again, other people can do it differently. I'm not saying this is what people have to do, but in my opinion, the framework for me, Sunday morning should primarily be biblical theology, which means I'm going to preach through entire books. And I do have as a goal eventually to preach through all 66 books in the Bible from the Sunday morning pulpit. That's a framework for me. I do have, in my mind, a mechanism to allow for other topics. I could break in and do a topical series if I wanted to in between books. I do think that the midweek stuff is often very suitable for doing the more systematic type things or the more topical type things and going at a greater pace. And in fact, our body is transitioning towards that now, that the midweek service is going to be more of a faster pace, Genesis to Revelation in probably 2 years, rather than, take me 100 years to go Genesis to Revelation in the pace I currently take. But you guys have thoughts about that, about the importance of maybe getting back to biblical theology, or would you push back and say, no, I think systematic theology is a good thing to be kind of drilling over and over again?
Yeah, last episode, I think I talked about how I do my systematic theology, and I think the way I do it, at least the way I'm trying to do it, is through biblical theology. If I want to define an idea, which is doing systematics, here's my statement on perseverance of the saints. I do that by reading Genesis to Revelation and trying to extract an idea from the whole of the text, not just trying to find my proof texts that support a particular idea. So, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think, well, this is, I guess, what Greg was saying, that systematic theology can be biblical theology. They don't have to be opposed to each other. But like we said before, I mean, relying on a system it's faulty. We have to stick with the word, be humble and open to what the word says, and I think, yeah, and you said, Joe, about going through the Bible in a fast pace. I think there's definitely a time for that. As a matter of fact, a few years ago, I challenged people to read the Bible in 90 days, and there was probably 7 or 8 people. And our church is relatively small, but so 7 or 8 people took up that challenge, and they finished the Bible. I was one of them, so I was leading by example. But we read the Bible in 90 days, and there was so much value in that, because rather than dissecting every individual detail along the way, you get the big picture that way. The big picture becomes clearer when you cover Scripture like that. So I think there's value in doing that, and I think, I guess maybe we would need to perhaps unpack a little bit more of what would be the difference between biblical theology and systematic theology, because I think they should be kind of one and the same thing, working together to reveal the truth.
And I think I would only say that systematics are a fruit of biblical theology. I think trying to arrive at systematics without the root of that being biblical theology, and we do need to define that. But I think it'll end up being bad fruit eventually.
Sure.
That's why I said putting the cart before the horse. And so certainly people use these terms differently. The idea in my mind, and you guys can tell me if you think about it differently, biblical theology is doing that exegetical task that Eric, you were describing. If I'm studying Paul's book, 1 Corinthians, then I'm trying to understand the historical context of this book. I'm trying to, and this is more than theoretical, right? We already talked about this because there was a chapter in 1 Corinthians that we differ on. And so the work of trying to study, okay, what is their historical situation? The fact that we know that they wrote a letter that was sent with Chloe's delegation to Paul that we don't have, so we don't know exactly what questions they were asking. So we know that he's responding to something, but we're doing our best to try and prayerfully, exegetically understand, okay, his response means something to them because they asked a question first and now he's responding. And so we're trying to work through these issues, follow his train of thought, understand it within that book itself, understanding it maybe within now the whole Corinthian correspondence. We have at least 2 letters, of course, that were canon for us, although there's all sorts of scholarly debate over, whether there was possibly a lost letter or 2 Corinthians is a composite document. You're not aware of all those issues. That's the stuff that if you really get into the commentaries, these things are there. But you got to wrestle through some of those issues and say, okay, what does this mean? And then once we have that, Greg, if we would do the hard work that you were describing, if we do that for every single book, that takes forever. And then it's only after doing that hard work that we do that for all 66 books that we could attempt to begin to systematize and say, what does the Bible actually say about money, relationships, head coverings, which we already talked about, was easy because there's just this one passage.
Yep.
At least easier, although it doesn't mean that we all agree.
Not simple.
Not simple, yeah, but at least an easier path, because I don't have 100 texts that talk about it. I just have one. Whereas if we start at systematics, we're putting infants in the graduate level course, and they think that they have all the answers because somebody who's very articulate tells them that, but they don't realize if we put them in the other side's graduate level course, that side would sound really good too, because people, you see it in the content, in the comments as well, or I hear it from just people that I talk to. People latch on to a single verse and they think, 1,500 years of debate has happened. You apparently must not have read this one verse. No, people read that verse and people have talked about that verse.
Because because the way systematics is normally done is we say, okay, what do we believe about angels? And then we either go into the Bible or you go to your favorite Bible search software and search for the word angels. And here's you print that out and you say, here's my composite belief or understanding about it, angelology, as opposed to doing what the biblical, the thorough march through the long march through the text.
Yeah. And so it takes so much more time. I mentioned that to you guys before. I think that if I wanted to train people in systematic theology, I can do it over one luncheon. I can feed you lunch. I can tell you the points. I can give you the proof text. We can leave all patting ourselves on the back thinking how smart and mature we are. If you want to read your Bible in 90 days, like Eric, you did, it takes you 90 days. And that's fast. And that requires a big time commitment. That was probably an hour or two of reading every single day for most people, if I'm not mistaken. Does that sound about right?
It was about 13 to 15 chapters a day. So it was quite a bit.
I happen to believe in that pace. I don't know if you know this. I wrote a book called Every Word, Read Your Bible in 90 Days. So I'm really behind that methodology. I don't know if you guys continued or if anybody continued, but keeping up that pace, it takes a commitment, and it's much longer than a luncheon. And so most people don't do that work, and then they jump into systematics. And then that's why the fruit of our systematic discussion is not unity, but division, because everybody's fighting with each other. Whereas the more we'll read the Bible, the more we'll realize, hey, wait a second, there actually are some passages here that are really challenging. There are verses here that my systematic never brought up. There are verses here that they really read differently than I would have expected. And when Micah was with us talking about, the eschatology conversation that we had, he made a statement, I think that's very profound, that I think a lot of people can relate to, that when we'll start, it was the same thing for him. When he started, he said about 10 chapters a day. So it was probably slightly longer than 90 days for him to read through. He was getting to passages that seemed to indicate a meaning or an understanding different than what his system required. And so it caused him to throw the system off. If all we ever do is systematic theology, then when I read certain buzzwords, Greg, you mentioned angels or elect, predestination, foreknowledge, certain buzzwords, these big ones, my system already has all the answers for me, and it already tells me the text that I should jump to. And it doesn't explicitly say it, but it also tells me the text to avoid. Like there are certain verses I don't go to, because these aren't the ones that the systems talk about. And so when I'm looking at a text, and I fell into this trap early on. All right, if I'm going to expose what this means, that means now I got to go and grab you all the proof text from the system that I've studied and I'm an advocate of and an expert in. But if I'm doing biblical theology first, I have the freedom to approach every text with a fresh perspective and say, okay, God, what does this text say? And I have a confidence. I'm not afraid that I'm going to read something, and if I rightly understand it, that it's going to contradict anything anywhere else. Like you guys don't think that the Bible contradicts itself. So instead of me coming to a verse and saying, well, this verse understood in its context, if I'm going to do the hard work, actually really study this passage out, I'm not afraid that if I understand that passage, it's going to contradict anything anywhere else. I do realize it might challenge the system I previously held. Because and Eric, you said this previously, oftentimes people who come from a system, they come up with these ingenious interpretations that if you're just reading that text, you would never come to that conclusion. But because the system requires it, the system demands it, now I can make it sound really articulate. I can make it sound really spiritual. But anybody just reading that text would be like, I never would have come to this. And that's why I think it takes the Bible away from people. Whereas if we just stick to the text and say, this is what it means, this is it in its context, this is it in its chapter, or its theme or its idea. Sometimes that's less than a chapter. Sometimes it's more than a chapter. I think that the Bible really starts to come alive for most people because they go, oh, I'm reading this and it seems to mean what it says. Like it doesn't require this gymnastics of going through. And it doesn't mean that we're ignoring the rest of the Bible. It doesn't mean that we're not being systematic. But if we're actually allowing the Bible to speak for itself, to expose it, I think sticking to the text and really trying not to deviate and bring in 13 other passages every single time I'm in a chapter, to me, I find to be very helpful. I think that that's the most exposing. And then eventually, after a long period of doing that, we can start to systematize. But I don't want to throw systematic theology out. I just want to put the cart firmly behind the horse instead of in front of it.
Hey, thanks for watching this clip of the Exalted Christ One Accord podcast. If you like what you've seen here, click here to catch the full episode, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any of our future content.